So this is where we stopped in the last lesson, where we did this match moving, recreating the 3D scene. Let's say we want to render the shot. How do we go about it? If you camera tracked your footage, when you go into the compositing tab here, there'll be a bunch of orders that looks very complicated if you have never seen it before. So just to get the idea across, let's just select everything and hit delete. So I could show you exactly what it means by building it step by step together. So let's go back to the layout tab. Let's come here to render. Now, if I hit F12 or if I come to render image, it's going to render our CG object, which is this ball, and also our shadow and every other shadow in the scene. Now, in terms of render settings, this is what Blender gives us by default. First of all, I make sure device is set to GPU compute. Now, if you have a GPU, if you have NVIDIA GTX or RTX or some sort of dedicated GPU, you should choose GPU. If you don't have a GPU, you should choose CPU. Now, if I go to edit and preferences and system, you would see none. In terms of cycles render devices, you see none, CUDA, optics, HIP, and one API. So depending on the GPU you are using, since I am using an RTX GPU, so that is an NVIDIA RTX GPU, I chose optics. If you are using an NVIDIA GPU like the GTX series, you choose CUDA. If you are using an AMD GPU, so not CPU, but GPU, an AMD GPU on your laptop, you can use HIP. And if you are using an Intel GPU, you can use one API. So let me take mine back to optics since I have an RTX 2080. Make sure it is checked. A good way to know what GPU you have or if you have a GPU is to come down here, right click and task manager, and then go to performance. This would show you all that you have connected to your PC. Now you can see this is my CPU. It's an Intel Core i9. This is my RAM. How many RAM you have, your memory, you'll see it here. This is my SSD and other devices that I've connected. All this disk is your storage. All the SSDs and USB drives I've connected to my laptop. And when you scroll down, you should be able to see GPU. Now, if you see something that has Intel graphics, you have an onboard GPU that is part of your CPU. But if you see something like NVIDIA RTX or NVIDIA GTX or something like that, you know that you have a separate dedicated GPU. So if you don't see anything like that here, in your performance tab, in your task manager, you know you don't have any of that. So for me, I'm using an RTX, so I choose optics. We can save preferences here. Now, make sure GPU compute is selected. The next thing is the noise threshold. So this is for your viewports. All the settings are for your viewport while you're working inside of Blender. Let's minimize this. Now this is your render settings. So when you hit render, this is the settings that we use. For me, I like to set my threshold. The default is too much in my opinion. I like to set my threshold to something like 0.1, anywhere from 0.1 to 0.5, depending on how fast you want it to be. So 0.5 would be faster in most cases. So let's leave it at something like 0.2 or 0.4. Then for samples, the default is 4,000 samples, which is crazy because most of the time I don't use more than 100 samples in most of my animations. So let's set this to 100. You can even use 50 if you have denoising turned on. And that is the next thing. Make sure the noise is turned on here, denoise. And for me, I usually select open image denoiser because I tested it and I realized that works best for me. Albedo and normal, yes. Accurate and high. And if you have a GPU, this is something I recently discovered. Clicking use GPU is going to add at least like 30 to 40% more speed to your renders. So since I have a GPU, I click use GPU. Now when we click render, it will render faster. You can see up here, frame 110. It shows you the amount of time it took the last time it rendered, 11 seconds. And it shows you the time it has currently taken for this render and the remaining time. Now this render took 13 seconds because we have changed our settings. It didn't take too long, 13 seconds. And we have just the CG object and the shadow. In the next chapter, when we are talking about post-production and compositing, we'll learn about how to render passes, how to render your objects separately and render your shadows separately. But now we are rendering just our CG object and our CG shadow. Now you can leave it like this if you want to composite in a program outside Blender, which is what I do. I'm either doing my compositing in DaVinci Resolve or I'm doing it in After Effects or Premiere Pro or any editing software. But if you want to render the entire full image, including the background video, this is how you do it. You come to your compositing tab, make sure use nodes is checked. Now this is all the jargons that you saw on your screen back then. Let's just start recreating it. So Shift A and add a movie clip. Now this movie clip should contain your background video. If it doesn't contain it, you can just click on this open clip here and go find your background video. Now the next thing you want to add is your render layers. So Shift A, render layer. So this is what you just rendered. When you render a frame, this is what you get. You get your CG object and your shadow. Now what you want to do in the compositing tab is to layer this CG object on top of your background video. So to do that, we need an alpha over node. So Shift A and search for alpha over. Now connect the background video to the top. Make sure the background is on top and connect your CG to the bottom. Now we are not seeing anything yet. So Shift A and add a viewer and connect the image to the viewer. And now you can see your final image. If I hold Ctrl Shift and I click on the movie, it shows me just the movie. You can see the viewer has moved to the movie clip. If I click on the render layers while holding Ctrl Shift, it showed me just the render layer. If I click on the alpha over, it shows me the combination of both of them. Now let's add a composite node and also connect this image to composite. Now when we hit render F12, it's going to render our CG like before, but it's not going to stop there. After rendering the CG, after denoising, it's now going to add the background to it. Now it's done. So now we have the background and the CG. So this is like the quick way to get your renders out there. So this is just rendering an image. If we go to our output settings, output properties, this is where we tell Blender the folder we want to render our animation to. So if we don't tell Blender, it's just going to send your renders to a temp folder. We don't want that. So click on this folder. Let's say we add a new folder in here and call it render. So this is Blender's file view. So you can use this to go to different files on your PC. So let's say I go to my desktop and I added a new folder called render. So click accept and you'll see now it shows you where the folder is. So this is the folder to start saving these things in. And you also need to choose a file name. So let's click here and let's write ball render. Now you see it shows C user desktop render ball render. So it's going to render the animation and name it ball render. Now we have file format. By default it gives you PNG. If you want to render as a video, straight as a video, which I do not recommend because you don't have a lot of freedom with that. If you want to render as a video, you can just change this from PNG to FFmpeg video and come down to encoding and change this from Matroska to MPEG-4. So when you render this, you render it as an MP4 video, but I don't recommend this. Nobody should do this. You should try as much as possible to have enough freedom with your video, except what you have here when you're looking at your composite tab is exactly what you need. It's perfect. You don't need to do anything else. You don't need to do a color grade. You don't need to do a composite, which is rarely the case. Except that, then you can just render like this. But I wouldn't recommend this. I would recommend you go back to PNG instead. Make sure RGBA is selected, especially if you're rendering just your CG elements. You want RGBA. A stands for alpha, which means it's going to render as a transparent image. Now that you have this, just leave the rest of the settings the same. Color depth at 8-bit, that's alright. Compression at 15%, that's alright. Now when we hit Ctrl F12 or go to render and render animation, Ctrl F12, it's going to start from the beginning, from frame 1 to the end of the frame, so frame 280. So it's going to start from the beginning and render all the way to the end. So you can set that here, frame range, start frame, end frame. So if you want to render only frame 100 to frame 180, you can set it here. Start at 100 and end at 180. So you see Blender now makes your entire timeline to be just 100 to 180. So it's going to render just this part of the image. So if I hit Ctrl 12, it's going to start at frame 100 and keep rendering different images till it gets to 180. So that's the best way to do it. You can see it has done 100, it has done 101, it's doing 102 now, it's going to go to 103. Now if I go into my file explorer and find that folder, I will be able to see the render folder here. And you can see as I'm rendering it out, it's adding new images. So ball render, which is the name of the file that we selected, ball render 100 for frame 100, ball render 101 for frame 101, and you just keep going. So it's going to render each and every one of those frames. You can see it has added a new one. It has added 104. So we're just going to keep going till 180. Personally, I don't like doing this. I don't like to render my CG and my background at the same time. So let's go to the compositing and just go straight from render layer to composite. Yeah, from render layer to viewer. So let's just ignore all of this. Yeah, and just go straight from the render layers to the composite. So when we hit Ctrl 12 here, we are going to get just the CG object, and that is what we need. Now I'm in DaVinci Resolve. I just want to show you guys how I attach the background video to the CG while I'm editing. Let's say you don't combine them together in compositing and Blender and you want to render them separately. First thing you need to do when you open DaVinci Resolve is to come here to your editing tab, then drop in your background video here. Now this is set to landscape, so let's go to File, Project Settings, use Vertical Resolution. So it's like a portrait vertical video. So we have rendered about 14 or 15 of these. So let me just show you how to go about this in DaVinci Resolve. So if we come to our media tab here, and you can now navigate to exactly where you saved your renders. So for me, that's desktop, new folder, render, and this is it. Now it doesn't display as images here, even though in the file you can see they are individual images, but in DaVinci Resolve it just takes everything as an image sequence. So let's just drag this and drop it here. And now I take this and I drop this here, and that's basically how I attach these things to my scene. So if we had rendered the entire animation from frame 1 all the way to frame 280, would have had this entire animation with the video playing from beginning to the end. But here, since we rendered just about 15 or so frames, we have just this tiny part of the video. And you can see it is well tracked to the scene. It is fitting into the scene. So in the next chapter, we'll talk about how to render this shadow separately and this object separately, so we can mess with the shadows, we can mess with the opacity, with the blur to make it match the background even better. Because you can see here, the shadow here is not this dark, it's not this dark, you know, so we can make it a little bit brighter to match the actual shadow in the background image. And we can do all sorts of things in compositing. We can make our render a little bit blurrier so it matches well with the background. We could adjust color correction to make sure things match properly. But then the key thing is to figure out the CG part properly. So far you have the right lighting, the right environment, you know, the right textures on your environment, so we can bounce correct lighting onto our object. Remember the camera projection thing for us to get the right texture on the floor and on the walls, so we can have the right light bounces. That is the most important part, because if you can get that down right, the rest are going to be easier. If your lighting is on point, you get the correct light intensity, the correct light color and light direction, and all the CG part is done properly, you have an easy time in compositing. Anyways, we'll talk about that in chapter 3.